Preparing for another pandemic. This episode tonight is dedicated to the fact that the UK has now opened its public inquiry terms of reference consultation, and the WHO has begun a process to develop a pandemic preparedness treaty to plan for future pandemics. As always, there appears to be more than meets the eye. Now, this happens as scientists continue to caution that the current pandemic is not over, given a resurgence in cases sweeping the UK, with infections up more than 40% in the last 7 days and a record high in the over 70s. In fact, myself personally, I know more people in my personal network that have had COVID in the last 2 weeks than the entire past 2 years. Yet, despite this, all the remaining COVID travel measures, including passenger locator forms and such, and tests for unvaccinated arrivals, finally, thankfully, have all gone. And as media attention turns elsewhere, life also goes on. And isn't it fascinating to observe how now cases are pretty much at a parallels where they were at winter, kind of certainly mid-December time? Yet because the focus has gone elsewhere, the media are paying attention elsewhere, the hysteria that comes with it has all gone as people live their lives, which really is tantamount to the fact that we never really were following a scientific process after all. And in fact, the nature of tonight's episode, really focusing on the public inquiry, is really important to recognize that we have to heed the lessons from the past 2 years. Otherwise, we really do risk this happening again. And not only is that risk magnified by what's become normalized and moralized over the last 2 years, but also the threat of the pandemic treaty by the WHO really threatens to legitimize these elements that have been so, in my view, wrongfully utilized over the last 2 years. So we're here to talk tonight about primarily the release of the terms of reference consultation for the public inquiry in the UK, because of course, in my view at least, this should very much precede any future treaties, either at a national or international level, because let's ask the simple question here in Common Sense Corner on a Friday night. Surely if you're going to create a pandemic preparedness treaty to ensure that you are well planned for any future outbreak of a new virus, not that we hope to see any new virus in the near future, but such plans would surely come off the back of an extensive and holistic review, inquiry, assessment of what has just happened in the last 2 years. But these things are happening in parallel. And of course, we know of most public inquiries, this will take an extensive period of time. It will be a long, labored process. The conclusions are probably already foretold and foregone. It's probably already a closed book. But nonetheless, it's something that we must go through, and actually we must seek to influence, which I'll talk about during this episode. So really, whilst there is a lot of conversation about the WHO treaty, and I'll speak more about this, I originally did a broadcast on this in December last year, and I'll put the links to last year's broadcast in the comments because it's still relevant to today, particularly when it compares the kind of proposals of the WHO treaty with the current legislation. It's important to make those distinctions. But I'll be covering the treaty in more depth because, again, that's all about pandemic preparedness. But in the scope of tonight's conversation, I'm going to focus on primarily the public inquiry in the United Kingdom, which we hope to see similar approaches happening around the world. And indeed, actually, there is actually a more formal need, I believe, for a global inquiry, given that many of the central actors were integral. And by central actors, I'm referring to the likes of the WHO, WEF, other public-private partnerships, other central institutions that have been instrumental in what they have done, or in some cases what they have not done. Take the UN, for instance, in upholding the Human Rights Charter. So the public inquiry really ought to precede any preparedness plans. It ought to precede any preparedness treaty. Now, the treaty, again, there's lots of hype around that at the minute. It's early in its process, and there will be work to be done in the same way that there is work to be done across the public inquiry. But the public inquiry is really the opportunity to extract and make sense of what the heck just happened over the last 2 years. And I was witnessing a conversation on Twitter just the other day. If you want a healthy state of mind, it's never a good idea to go on Twitter, but nonetheless, needs must. And the individual was speaking about how he couldn't get his head around the arguments that he had with his wife around the lockdown measures when they would dispute each other around whether they could go out again for another walk because they've already been out for 30 minutes earlier in the day. And could they go up for a second walk for another 30 minutes later in the day? And during that time, and it plagues me when I think about it, how people behave during that time is quite frankly shocking on the basis that people just took those instructions at face value. Now, of course, you could go out 1,000 times a day and not make contact with another human being and it wouldn't make a difference. Yet, there is so much to be learned from the last 2 years, so much to be learned. And if we don't actually go through the entire thing with a fine-tooth comb, then we really do face the possibility of seeing all of this as a continued process, not only normalized, but even passed as legislation with things like the treaty. So let's start by recognizing the absolute need to question everything about what has gone before us over the past 2 years. And to quote Claire Dyer from her article in the British Medical Journal, the BMJ, the UK Parliament was denied the power to properly scrutinise laws relating to COVID-19 for 2 years, a situation that must not be repeated in any further future emergencies. The House of Commons Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee has such declared. I thoroughly agree. How is it that Parliament has been unable to scrutinise any laws or policy? But even though the protocols for scrutiny were lacking, and I'll speak about that in a moment, the appetite to scrutinise was seemingly absent throughout this. And we've witnessed it. I mean, I've been broadcasting for 18 months plus, 500 episodes. The amount of criticism that myself, my guests, those who have asked cutting questions, those who have scrutinised, have throughout the entire time been reduced to conspiracy theorists, anti-vaxxers, or even worse. You know, if you look at some of Trudeau's recent comments, yeah, as we predicted, but none of us want to enter into the I told you so mode, because that just doesn't serve anyone. But many of the questions that were raised as early as January 2020, as early as March 2020, prior to lockdowns, were valid questions, and they continue to have been valid questions all the way through. But that scrutiny has not only been woefully absent in a political way, and I'll explain that in a moment, but it's been frowned upon, forbidden. It's been censored and cut up, cancelled. So there's been no appetite for scrutiny. So to reiterate, there is the absolute requirement to question everything. But as I stated at the outset, what are the likelihood or the likelihood of this inquiry actually coming to any meaningful conclusions? And at one point, and it's still not clear if it's changed, but it seemed that Boris Johnson himself, the Prime Minister, would get the ultimate say on the terms of reference for the topics of the inquiry, which would absolutely limit any scrutiny of his own conduct and that of some of his aides and officials. Now, that may well have changed since the outset, and I truly hope that it has. And we have seen that the consultation has come forward to scrutinize the terms of reference. And I'll speak extensively about that here because there are many limitations as expected. But is this going to be another drawn out, forlorn conclusion, theatre of a public inquiry? Or will this come to any meaningful conclusions? And the reality is that it must. And in fact, it must come quickly to some degree, because there is some recognition that this virus, SARS-CoV-2, will be with us for a while as it continues to mutate and become hopefully endemic. We may be in that phase now, but who knows with the resurgence that we're seeing now at this unpredictable time. But nonetheless, will we see the return of these draconian measures once again next winter, or even now? Are we just one click away from the hysteria machine? Let's say everything is resolved peacefully, and hopefully peacefully and rapidly in Ukraine. Let's say that comes to a closure and this COVID cases continue to rise. Could we be back in the fear zone all over again, as we've witnessed in the last 2 years? Or have we now finally recognized and accepted, almost a quiet acceptance, that herd immunity, natural herd immunity, is the only way out and has been the only way out since the very beginning? Is there any quiet acceptance of that behind closed doors, quiet whispers, these interventions haven't really worked? The data shows that they haven't worked. So perhaps now it's time just to allow nature to run its course, like we should have done in the beginning, and just shielded those who were most vulnerable. Because I remember reading data from January 2020, February 2020, some of the early studies coming out of China, some of the early reports have quite clearly showed, despite assertions in the media, that this virus had a bias in its innate presentation towards the elderly and those who are previously sick or currently with comorbidities. All of that was ignored since day one. Ignored. We can't allow that to happen again. We quite simply cannot allow it to happen again. It blows my mind every time I think about it. Anyway, let's not get distracted by how my mind is blown by this. But if you recall, the Coronavirus Act came into force back in March 2020. It gave the government emergency powers to deal with the pandemic. And it contained a sunset clause under which most of its provisions would expire 2 years later on the 25th of March, 2022, finally about to come around. It has been said, and we'll cover this in a future episode as well, but there are a number of those clauses that look like they may be wrapped into legislation to continue beyond the Coronavirus Act, but we'll speak about that another time. But the MPs could not amend the Act. They couldn't object to any of the particular powers. They could only vote to renew the legislation every 6 months on a take it or leave it basis, pretty much. Yes, there was some amendments over the course of the term, but voting down the act as the whole became really the only option, which was an unlikely scenario given what was considered to be a national emergency. So the game was rigged, whether by intent or otherwise. I'm not going to get into conspiracy. The game was set up. Let me just say the conditions were not favorable to scrutiny. And we've witnessed that throughout, not only on a national level, but an international level. So as with many things, it's the rules of the game that determine how things work. And it's really important that those rules, the setup, the frameworks are included in the terms of this inquiry, because it's the nature of the way decisions are made and the systems upon which they are created that predicate everything that follows. So let's talk about the public inquiry. It's set to begin its work in spring 2022, anytime now, starting with this consultation around the terms of referenced. It's been established under the Inquiries Act 2005 with full powers, including the power to compel the production of documents and to summon witnesses to give evidence under oath. Now we'll finally see perhaps how shambolic the government's documents actually are, how shambolic the evidence actually was, how inappropriate some of those expert witnesses seemingly under the guise of expertise were inappropriate for use. And it's said under the terms of the inquiry that it will play a key role in examining the UK's pandemic response and ensuring that we learn the right lessons for the future. Well, let's unpack that sentence. A key role in examining the UK's pandemic response. Well, it may examine the pandemic response through a lens that the government chooses and ensuring that we learn the right lessons. The right lessons. How do we know what the right lessons are? How do we know what they are in advance? The language is awkward for me, but I'm also skeptical about the role that this will actually play in learning the right lessons for the future. I have certainty that we'll need to create a review process alongside this inquiry to actually go through a fine-tooth comb of the key evidence. I could be wrong, And there is the opportunity to become what's known as a core participant in the inquiry, where key individuals and organizations will have the opportunity to present evidence throughout. And I'll speak more about some plans that myself and others have in order to get that core participant role and play and continue this journey and help to influence the trajectory of the inquiry itself. But I'll speak more about that at the end. But in theory, the inquiry itself will have the full might of the Inquiries Act, and as such will force a level of transparency that we've not witnessed before. The Prime Minister's appointed the Right Honourable Baroness Heather Hallett, DBE, as chair of the forthcoming public inquiry. She retired from the Court of Appeal in 2019, was made a crossbench life peer. She's conducted a number of high-profile and complex inquests in the past, inquiries, reviews, including acting as the coroner for the inquest into the deaths of the 52 victims of the 7/7 bombings in 2005 in London. She served as the chair of the Iraq fatalities investigations and chair of the 2014 Hallett review of the administrative scheme to deal with the on the runs in Northern Ireland. So she's experienced, and the response so far in general has been favorable, which is a good start. But to further my skepticism around the terms of the pandemic inquiry, the actual preamble itself within the scope of the inquiry raises alarm bells. And I think many of us, particularly of those of us who have been questioning throughout, anticipate that the inquiry will take the line of it should have happened earlier, longer, harder, and such. That we should have locked down sooner, for longer, more aggressively, and the assumption that the inquiry will take that angle or tone. And there is a possibility that it will do so on the basis of the preamble. Now, of course, sympathies with those who did lose loved ones throughout the pandemic. But quite rightly, it's important to recognize that the pandemic response, the measures themselves, have taken a great toll, including mortality, loss of life. And we cannot allow this inquiry to center upon purely and myopically the sad loss of life attributed to COVID-19. And I say attributed because that's an important part of the inquiry that needs to be unfolded. But I always say these things with just gentleness, because I do appreciate that people have suffered. But it's important to recognize we've all been through this, and many of us have suffered in our own unique ways, and that must be taken into account. But I do again come to this with some skepticism on the basis that the preamble inside the terms itself center upon the public engagement of the bereaved families and those affected. And again, there is that risk of taking that myopic view. And it's obviously a highly emotionally charged issue, death. And I know that there are groups out there advocating for some of those longer, harder, stronger measures on the basis that they've lost loved ones and believe that it could be prevented. And it is possible with sound public health information, I'll add, that those deaths could have been prevented. But we've not had sound public health information. But I also do feel for those who have lost families that it's important to recognize the flaws that the government have made, and that may not be in the terms that perhaps people are perceiving are the problem. But there is a risk here within the preamble that the focus of the inquiry will be around how could we have minimized the deaths from COVID or associated with COVID. And of course, we know that there are many problems with the way that the COVID cases, hospitalizations of deaths have been categorized, attributed, and counted and reported. We haven't got a transparency. That is clearly a key part. That must be a key part of the inquiry itself. But if the public inquiry only focuses on how do we minimize COVID deaths and doesn't provide adequate holistic assessment of the overall harms created as a result of the pandemic response, namely the healthcare metrics, which I'll talk about in a minute, with record hospital waiting lists, the missed cancer diagnosis. I'll go into more depth on these things, but the healthcare economy, mental health, social fabric, human rights, liberties, you must account for these things and the lives lost because of lockdown and for shutting the hospitals down. We cannot have a myopic, emotionalized view of the inquiry that is filtered only upon the bereaved due to COVID. It's important that we must recognize the harms caused by lockdown. But the government, it seems, would prefer to focus on the COVID deaths and the COVID bereaved and avoid the painful contemplation that's required to analyze the harms that lockdowns have brought, including those with mental and physical health issues, the livelihoods that have been lost, the education days that have been lost, the impact it's going to have on children's futures, just to say a few things. Is it a closed book before it even begins on this basis? We will see. Well, the terms of reference themselves set out the aim of the inquiry to produce a factual narrative account of the impact. This is the term, this is the wording of impact, the impact of and the response to the pandemic across all 4 countries in the UK. But it stipulates also that this doesn't prevent any of the devolved nations conducting their own inquiry. There are a number of areas to be examined and specified, including how decisions were made, how they were communicated and implemented, intergovernmental decision-making, and the availability and use of data and evidence throughout local, central, and devolved government institutions. The term of reference intend to cover preparedness, the public health response, the response in health and care sector, and our economic response. But as I say, what is the ultimate objective? If it's purely to mitigate COVID deaths, then we're going to miss all of the lessons learned. The focus of the inquiry has to look at the aggregate and holistic impact of the response to COVID-19 and the decisions that were made and how those decisions were made and the systems of operation surrounded those decisions. Now, I will say, in terms of the terms of reference, it is more broad than any of us imagined. But it's only a 2-page document, and I might see if I can actually bring the document up on the screen now so that you can actually witness it yourself. Let's see if we can do this, because it's important that you get a sense of what the government's actually doing here. Let's see if we can actually bring this up here. May cause a few problems, but let me see what I can do. Yes, here we go. So these are the draft terms of the inquiry. It's just 2 pages long, which I think is a blessing, because whilst I am about to criticize the lack of detail, the fact that now anyone can read this into just 2 pages means that we can appropriately comment on the framework. Because if it had been a 30, 40, 50 page, 100 page, 200 page document riddled with jargon, that would have railroaded the process before we've even got started. So you can see here the aims of the inquiry: to examine the COVID-19 response to the pandemic in England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, and produce a factual narrative account, including the following items: preparedness and resilience, how decisions were made, communicated, and implemented, intergovernmental decision-making, the availability and use of data and evidence, the legislative and regulatory control, shielding and the protection of the clinically vulnerable, the use of lockdowns and other non-pharmaceutical interventions, such as social distancing and the use of face coverings, testing and contact tracing and isolation, restrictions on attendance at places of education. Notice the omission there of places of worship, not mentioned. The closure and reopening of hospitality, retail, sport, leisure, and culture institutions, housing and homelessness, prisons and other places of detention, the justice system, immigration and asylum, travel and borders, and the safeguarding of public funds and management of financial risk. So in these core terms, you can see that they are broad enough that some of the key evidence, if we have the opportunity to provide it, is going to be you could put within these frames. But I also think they are vague. They are so vague that unless we're able to get more specific, then there's a risk that the key evidence will be missed under the vagueness of these terms. But the good news is, at least, is that the broad categories give us some scope in order to provide the appropriate evidence, provided that sufficient organizations and individuals can reach the core participant status. You would normally see several hundred core participants with an inquiry. I'd expect to see more, actually, for this type of inquiry, in order that the appropriate evidence is provided. But within the scope document, I do think the consultation that we're about to embark on must include more specific terms in order to ensure that the key evidence is covered. It goes on to talk about the response of the health and care sector. Again, in terms of preparedness, it's talking specifically about hospitals and care homes, initial capacity, availability of capacity, management of the pandemic in hospitals, including infection prevention, triage, etc. The management of pandemic in care homes and other care settings. Of course, we know from the very outset, shocking decisions were made, sending infected individuals from hospitals into care homes. At one point, 50% of the deaths could be attributed to care homes early on from those tragic decisions. So it's evident that there is going to be, and already some of that has been brought out into the public, there's obviously going to be some very damning evidence. It goes on to talk about the procurement and distribution of key equipment and supplies, including PPE. I think that needs to be looked at more broadly. I'll comment on that in a moment because of the cronyism. Development of therapeutics and vaccines. And again, I've got plenty on that. I'm sure we all have. The consequences of the pandemic on the provision for non-COVID related conditions, i.e. abandoning everything that wasn't COVID during the course of the pandemic, and the provision for those experiencing long COVID. Then the economic response to the pandemic is an impact in terms of the support businesses and individuals, funding that was put out, etc., and so on. And then it goes on to speak about how the inquiry will identify the lessons to be learned from the above, and therefore inform the UK's future pandemics. Again, to reiterate what I've already said, that the key aim of the inquiry begins with, again, the experiences of the bereaved families and those who have suffered hardship or loss as a result of the pandemic. Again, of course, they very much deserve a voice, but it cannot be limited to those groups. You know, those who have suffered hardship and loss as a result of the pandemic. How do you quantify hardship and loss, especially some of the well-being elements that Paul Dolan talks about in terms of our mental health, the erosion of social fabric, the erosion of civil liberties and human rights? How do you quantify those things? You know, our social life, the joy de vivre that comes from spending time with loved ones, you know, the importance of social bonds. How do you quantify those as losses within this context? But it must be done. It must be done. Otherwise, it will be missed. It must be accounted for. It goes on to say how it will highlight lessons identified for future preparedness, consider the future experiences on healthcare, any disparities evident in the impact of the pandemic and the state response in terms of inequalities. I mean, there's one thing that we can be sure upon is that inequalities have widened extensively. As usual, a crisis allows money to flow upwards, usually to those who set the rules, et cetera, et cetera. So yes, it is vague, but it's broad enough that the appropriate evidence, if the opportunity arises, should be able to be presented. So I appreciate that some small text there on the screen, but I am going to talk you through what I believe are some obvious omissions within that. Even though there is some level of breadth, I'm going to talk about some of the obvious omissions. Firstly, the lack of there has to be an analysis of the selection and maintenance of government advice and expertise, specific reference to the likes of SAGE, SPY-M, the modeling unit, SPY-B, looking at how decisions were made, looking at how people were selected, looking at conflicts of interest, looking at whether a breadth of expertise was onboarded. We know that it wasn't. We know that in the first stages, there were more people involved in behavioral science than there were virology and immunology. So there was a lack of social scientists. There's an absolute imbalance of expertise. And I think even though there is a category for how decisions are made and communicated in intergovernmental departments, it's too vague. We need to get specific on the use of scientific expertise. We need to get specific on the democratic accountability and the use of advisory committees. From the start, from the very beginning, this was governed in a kind of war cabinet-like way with Johnson, Raab, Gove, and Hancock, with Doctors Whitty and Vallance and their SAGE groupthink. And, as I've already talked about, parliamentary scrutiny was completely suspended. But if the government is going to subcontract these types of functions to unelected technocrats, then it should include a broad range of speciality. And SAGE, as I mentioned, was dominated by behavioral scientists, modelers, and really had a myopic fixation purely on COVID cases. And their remit was clearly not to assess the wider harms. In fact, I've interviewed a number of people from SAGE who confirmed those issues, and that there was just a relentless focus on COVID cases in the main. So you have to look at the wider collateral damage, the societal effects. You have to look at this in a holistic way, in an aggregated fashion. Now, it's important that the terms of reference include this broader analysis. Similarly, cost-benefit analysis, mentioning that there's no explicit reference to the woeful lack of cost-benefit analysis, but that should be a formal piece of evidence in itself. The decision-making frameworks that were used, particular reference to the over-reliance and dominance of modeling versus empirical, i.e. observed data, including the extraordinary weight given to the questionable is not even a strong enough term, the absolutely unforgivable modeling that led to lockdowns by Neil Ferguson at the outset, the disgraceful events of the October 2020, when the incorrect projections were used to justify once again a second lockdown. It must include the 2020 lockdown, where SAGE pushed for further lockdowns in the face of the Omicron. Where they pushed for further lockdowns in the face of Omicron, despite the emerging evidence from South Africa. Why was that type of evidence ignored and dismissed? Why was other evidence ignored and dismissed throughout this? The over-reliance on modeling. It doesn't seem that there's quite, whilst data is referenced in the terms of reference, there's an inadequate focus on the role of modeling. If we were to go back and look at each of the models that were used throughout the pandemic, you'd quite quickly see almost wrong every time. And as more data is accumulated, the empirical data, as over the time, you would expect to see a gradual improvement in the quality of modeling. But really, it comes down to the flawed assumptions that we use throughout. And I'm not even I have a firm grasp of mathematics. I did advanced statistics at university as part of my degree, and other key familiar with modeling techniques myself. But I haven't worked in science, and I haven't used those modeling techniques for many years. But quite clearly, I can observe that the assumptions that just were completely flawed. So why was that permitted, and why wasn't there scrutiny across the board? These things need to be looked at. The policy assumptions, also the conflicts of interests. Explicit review of the conflicts of interests across the SAGE department. Again, at the beginning, when you tot up the most active members of SAGE based upon their meetings attendance, you'd find that 16 out of the top 20 all had links with pharmaceutical companies, both in terms of working relationships or financial relationships, clearly going to influence the overall trajectory of the response. We need to be looking at the ethical frameworks of decisions, which will bring me on to talk about the use of behavioral science in a moment. Need to be looking explicitly at the Public Health England guidance in 2020. I remember reading that in 2020 and thinking, we'll never, ever, ever, ever know the actual impact of COVID-19 because of the way that this has been set up. I couldn't believe my eyes as I read the PHE guidance. I shared it across social media. I said, can't you all see? This is ludicrous. Got shot down, labeled all kinds of names. People didn't even read the guide. It just would make it almost physically impossible to ever know the actual true burden of COVID-19 in terms of its mortality in particular. The lack of case definition and diagnosis protocols. I'm getting somewhat into the granular stuff here. What's important to recognize the term of reference is about setting up the categories so that these specifics can be appropriately covered. But it has to be mentioned, there has to be a category around these things, around protocols that lead to the attribution of cases, hospitalizations, and deaths. Maybe it would be covered under the data elements, but I think it's broader than that. Similarly, the risk categorization, the actual assessment, categorization, and communication of risk. A number of 10, all the way back to March 2020, Michael Gove, and the same line has been used throughout, saying that the virus does not discriminate. saying that everyone is at risk, no one is safe until we're all safe. These lines have been etched in our minds, yet that from the very beginning it was clear that COVID was a highly discriminatory virus, that people over 75 were, up to 10,000 times more likely to die than people under 15. Who authorized the decision to press ahead with misinformation like that, telling the public that all age groups are at risk and reinforcing that? It's clear that most people watching this, even if you haven't taken a skeptical view on this over the course of the time, it's highly likely that your lived experience has not matched what you were witnessing by the government propaganda or the media communication. It's highly unlikely that your lived experience matches up with the intensity of which this whole thing has been messaged around. So government messaging and advertising, the fact that governments have spent a record amount on advertising in the press, advertising the restrictions, public health messaging, all of these things need to, government messaging and advertising needs its own section, as does behavioral science and nudge. On March the 22nd, 2020, a paper by SPI-B, the behavioral unit, said that the perceived level of personal threat, this is to quote, needs to be increased amongst those who are complacent, using hard-hitting emotional messaging, a clear directive to amplify the fear. Why was it agreed to use fear as a weapon to increase compliance with the coronavirus rules when the public were already showing signs of using their own discretion? What are the likely long-term mental health effects on adults and children of telling people repeatedly that they should be scared of each other, scared of COVID? The long-term harms of this are still unfolding now. The psyops were used to terrify people into believing that they were far greater risk than that was truthfully ever the case. They had conditions that led to neighbors, denouncing their neighbors. This is an utter disgrace to democracy. And I appreciate, again, I'm getting into some of the specifics, but it's really important that behavioral science, the lack of ethics and frameworks around behavioral science, the unrestrained use of behavioral science and subconscious priming tools without consent or consultation is just damning, and it sets the precedent for the future, a worrying precedent. So government messaging, advertising, behavioral science, all omitted from the categories. They must be included. Yes, the terms of reference does speak about the public health decisions, but again, just to give some context and some examples, for example, in the Netherlands, at the peak of the pandemic, the Dutch health system only lost 4% capacity. What percentage did the NHS lose? I remember early on in the pandemic, the capacity went down as low as 40%. So that's 60% drop, meaning, that meant that the critical diagnosis and treatments and surgeries were cancelled. We know that. But let's be clear, no matter what, whether it's the GP surgery or the hospitals, the virus is not to blame for the GPs failing to see their patients. The reality is doctors in most countries never stop seeing face-to-face appointments, but this is a function of the UK's response. The virus is not responsible for the devastating news that came out this week that the mental health services received a record 4.3 million referrals last year. 4.3 million. The Royal College of Psychiatrists call this the biggest hit to mental health in generations. You cannot undercount this. It's so essential that this report spans mental health, but also the radical decisions that were taken that have resulted in the longest hospital waiting list in the world, and nearly 750,000 missed cancer referrals. Our collateral damage death rate may soon be beyond horrifying as a result of these decisions. But how do you account for these things? We must be looking at the data. The virus itself is not to blame for the fact that the first appointment that the children can get within the child and adolescent mental health services is in 3 years' time now, because the waiting list is so long. This is going to lead to loss of life. It's going to lead to increased suicides. It already has. This is tragic. This has to be accounted for in the inquiry. Let's talk about the parliamentary process. I've already talked about the lack of scrutiny and the fact that MPs, not that they seemingly, aside from a few that had the courage through the COVID recovery groups, Dave Baker, Mark Harper, and various others, Graham Brady, many, several backbenchers had the courage to challenge things, the parliamentary process and judiciary was a mess. So the legislative and regulatory control element that's already specified must include the review of the dubious use of the 1984 Public Health Act as a basis for secondary legislation, which then itself enforced lockdown rules and penalties. The 1984 Act was never intended as a basis for confining the healthy, but proved more convenient to do so than the Civil Contingencies Act 2004, which would have required, if it had been used, repeat parliamentary scrutiny. So the choice of legislation, the blurred lines between legislation, guidance, there was many times where the government issued guidance that conflicted with the actual law, the legislation. When the legislation itself remained unchanged, the government was still able to use this guidance. There's huge public confusion. So the whole parliamentary process, the lack of checks and balances, the legal frameworks, the judiciary, all of this needs looking at. The fact that the Dolan case was thrown out so easily, so early on, that was a pivotal moment that could have changed the game if that had gone through. We have to be looking at those decisions and saying, were they the right decisions? The courts have a role to play in this, and we need to be evaluating the courts inside of the frame of the pandemic. What about government misinformation? What about the vaccine rollout in its entirety? The reality is the vaccine rollout, we're still in that zone where no one is within the media is really willing to put their head above the parapet. We're starting to see some gentle edging into critical questioning, but the horrors, just wait, over time, it's just unbearable. It's unbearable. So we have to ensure that is included within the terms of reference in its own right. And I continue, the external influences, whether that's the media, the unions. We had Ben Irvine on the show talking about the role of the unions and the pressure put on government, other global public-private partnerships, the WHO, the WEF, other central institutions, what impact they had, the central banking systems. What pressure did they put on governments to lock down? What conditions were precedents were set? All of this needs to be evaluated. Procurement, I've touched upon. The cronyism's been largely spoken about. This leads us to speak more broadly about government expenditure and public finance. The bills, the cost of managing COVID-19, 400 billion has been spent, if not more. We have to be, at this point where now we're entering a place where there's a potential fuel and food, energy crisis, inflation. Money was being printed on demand. For what? How many of these things were effective? How much of this money was put to good use? How much of this money ended up in crony accounts? How much of this money ended up in fraudulent businesses? The amount of money that's been wasted is off the scale. Yet now there's people out there crying out for support and they can't get a dime, a penny. We have to be looking at the way that the government money, the decisions around spending was made. The reality is, if there was an app where every time the government was about to waste millions and you could see how much it was going to cost you in tax as a notification on your screen, the reality is, I wonder if how many of these decisions would have been made because the public was seemingly unaware of this gross and egregious misuse of public funds. It's going to cost us for decades. We'll be paying for this for decades. That we haven't even touched upon the economic harms that have come from lockdowns and social distancing and all the pressures and shutdowns on business. All of these impact areas must be expressly reviewed. And not only the 400 billion spent, the fact that we've been robbed of 2 years of our lives, the unprecedented removal of basic freedoms, 100,000 children out of education, billions of collective education lost around the world, delayed cancer diagnosis and treatment, other serious illnesses, missing treatment, the unnatural prohibition of the most basic social interactions and communication. How many days in the last 2 years have two family members been completely healthy, yet unable to see each other? How many days have been lost? How many loved ones have been lost without saying goodbye? All of these things. How many young children growing up, babies born that have not seen their extended family for extended times? All of these things must be categorized in the collateral damage. We need to look at the impact of COVID, yes, but we've got to look at the impact on education, the economy, healthcare, mental health, society at large, the legalities, the human rights, the liberties, basic human relations. All of these things must be included in express terms to avoid simply myopically looking at, could we have reduced deaths by locking down for longer, harder, earlier, which is the risk, as I've mentioned. So the public inquiry is a good opportunity. It is a good opportunity to ensure that we do learn the lessons. But the frame of reference at this minute in time has severe limitations and it's too vague. And we've got a number of weeks in order to make sure we change that. Now, the way the inquiry is going to be run, first, the terms of reference will be formalized following this consultation. And it looks like the inquiry will follow what's called a modular approach, meaning that effectively a number of smaller inquiries with a specific scope will follow in sequence, meaning that thankfully those who will be core participants in providing evidence won't be required to review vast amounts of evidence for things that don't relate to their area of expertise. So what it should result in is a focus around core evidence and core expertise needed in order to get to that point where lessons can be learned. But the critical component, there's two critical components. One is the initial frame of reference, and the second is those who are accepted as core participants within the frame of the inquiry. So in terms of the public consultation, so there is a public consultation that you can take part in right now. It's open until the 7th of April at midnight or just before midnight to actually address some of the things I've talked about here today. Now, let me briefly tell you about some of the things that I myself and my team and wider connections are putting together. So we're in the process of forming what I'm calling a pandemic, a post-pandemic recovery and reform committee. And we will be looking at a number of issues on a national and global basis. Firstly, around public inquiries, in order to provide the tools and evidence with our partners to support national and global inquiries into the handling of the pandemic and the vaccine rollout. That's the first thing we're going to be looking to do. A pandemic reform committee to assemble the key partners that will enable us to assemble and support the evidence required to create the appropriate terms of reference in the first instance, and secondly, to provide a really solid evidence base across the different bodies that have been active over the last 2 years collating evidence. Secondly, beyond the public inquiry, we'll be looking at regulatory reform, looking at the development and approval process of pharmaceuticals, for instance, and the wider conflicts of interests, the role of non-governmental organizations and other central bodies in influencing decisions around pharmaceuticals. So really looking at how we can adjust the regulatory framework to make sure that this doesn't happen again. Number 3, pandemic preparedness. The reality is we do need to have a better plan for future pandemics. So working again with our partners to look at what a holistic preparedness framework would look like so that we are ready for any future incident. And also similarly tackling and challenging and disputing the WHO framework, which I alluded to at the very beginning. Fourthly, looking at global health governance, assessing the actual role of the WHO, and advocating either for a gross reform or a replacement of the World Health Organization as a governing body with specific reference to pandemics in this case. And then looking at medical ID and biosurveillance and putting the right to privacy back in the hands of the patient. So these are the 5 key areas we're going to be looking at, I'm sure amongst others, as part of a pandemic reform committee. So our first priority is to support the UK's terms of reference to make sure that we've got appropriate terms of reference. I had a meeting this morning alongside some of those stakeholders, including a number of lawyers. And what we're going to be doing is putting together some templates to support the consultation. So do watch this space. If you haven't already subscribed to our mailing list, this is the time to subscribe. We'll be keeping you up to date of all of our campaigns. So you can go to danjgregory.com/pandemic. That's Dan, J, the letter J, Gregory, com/pandemic and join our pandemic podcast mailing list. This is in the interim until we actually establish the formalities of the committee, but we'll keep you up to date through our mailing list. So we'll be sharing some of the templates that we'll be using to send and submit to the COVID recovery inquiry team that the government has assembled as part of the consultation. But in the meantime, I encourage you to submit your own views to the consultation, because the reality is each of us has been impacted by the response to COVID-19, and the more of us that submit our views, the more likely that this public inquiry truly represents the issues that need to be encountered. And the good news is the public inquiry survey is only 4 questions, and it's very simple. Those questions are as follows. Do the inquiry's draft terms of reference cover all the areas that you think should be covered by the inquiry? Yes or no? It's a simple answer. No. Which issues or topics do you think the inquiry should look at first? I've given you a list today. I'll copy and paste them into the comments later on. But the key question is, what do you think? The key question is gaining. What do you think the inquiry should prioritize? So again, that's an opportunity for you to look at what's most important to you. And then you can add in additional terms of reference that should be included as part of that response. The third question is pretty arbitrary, really, but it says, do you think that the inquiry should have a planned end date for its public hearings to ensure timely findings and recommendations? I would say yes. We need to ensure this doesn't last for decades, but it does need an appropriate window in order to gather evidence. And then lastly, number 4, how should the inquiry be designed and run to ensure that bereaved people or those who have suffered serious harm or hardship as a result of the pandemic have their voices heard? Now, this question is mightily important on the basis of what we've discussed here today. Of course, the voices of the bereaved are very, very important, and they absolutely quite rightly should be heard. But as should every one of us. Every one of us has experienced harms or losses or hardship in some way. You know, whether it's loss of social bonds, loss of income, loss of sanity, loss of friendships. You know, the harms extend broadly, and each of us have been faced. Each of us has experienced this in a unique way. So that key question number 4: how do you capture the individual and collective harms? That question is really important for you to consider from your own lens and put your take. How should the inquiry be designed to ensure that those effects upon all of us are well captured? So you can take part in the consultation by going to the website, which is COVID, and I'll put this on the screen in a minute, covid19.public-inquiry.uk. Quite clearly, they weren't able to get a very smart domain. I'll repeat that in a minute. I'm just going to put it on the screen so you've got it. But it's of critical importance that we participate in this. So it's covid19.public-inquiry.uk. You can see it there on the screen. I'll put it in the chat. I'll put it in the description. But you'll have the opportunity to take part in this inquiry and make sure that the appropriate evidence is indeed assessed. But it begins with, before we start, don't flood. I encourage you not to flood that form, not to flood the consultation with evidence. This is not the time for the evidence. This is the time to be very succinct about the terms of reference and how to capture the harms. Those are the 2 key questions. There'll be plenty of time for evidence. So don't bombard the survey with evidence. It's not going to be taken into account. This is about understanding the scope of the inquiry and how to capture the harms. And those are the 2 questions, number 1 and 4. So make sure you have a look at that. And again, we'll be providing template guidance. This is for UK citizens only at this period of time. But we would anticipate that over time, each individual nation, and I would encourage you to look up the latest from your own countries. You can look at your own government websites, type in public inquiry COVID and the name of your country into Google. This is inevitably going to be a process that's replicated around the world, which is why I said our Pandemic Reform Committee is seeking to support appropriate terms of reference on an international basis, but also looking at how we can establish a form of global inquiry, because the reality is that the national public inquiries will only have a limited reference to central bodies like the WHO, WEF, UN, vaccine manufacturers, pharmaceutical bodies, etc. All of these parts need to be looked at from an international scope, and it's our hope that we'll form a global coalition that enables us to do this. So it's going to be a lot of work. Many people are ready to check out from COVID, and quite rightly, it's been a drain on our lives for the last 2 years and continues to be in many ways. The effects of policy will be felt for years to come. But some of us have to go the distance. Some of us have to be willing to do the final 5 miles of the marathon. We've come so far, and having done a marathon myself, I just know how hard those final 5 miles are when you just want to go home. You just want to lie down. You just want to say enough is enough. Many of us probably feel that way. But some of us have to continue this journey. Some of us have to continue the course to make sure that lessons are learned, accountability is served, and that we never have to repeat the mistakes that we've seen over the last 2 years ever again. And to make sure that any treaties that are formed, any legislation that develops is respectful for those lessons and ensures that our liberties and rights are never harmed in such a way, and our choices are not violated in such a way as they've been over the last 2 years. So it's a big project. I anticipate probably 1 to 5 years worth of work here. Having spent the last 2 years commenting on this situation and being heavily involved in the activism and campaigning, I personally cannot let go. So I want to play a strong part in helping to shape and guide this going forward. And I'm sure many of you feel the same as well. So if you remain committed on the journey, firstly, please do subscribe to our mailing list. We infrequently mail you, but we'll keep you up to date about our projects, our campaigns, our content. We're going to be running a public inquiry series on the podcast. We've recorded our first episode of that series this week with Laura Dodsworth, looking at behavioral science, heeding some of the insights from her book, State of Fear. Watch out for that next week. We'll be broadcasting that next Thursday. But we also have a whole range of content planned as part of our own content series on this. But I'd like to keep you informed about the Pandemic Reform Committee as we start to form that, which will be a global entity. So wherever you are in the world, you'll have a point of reference for evidence and support around this. These post-pandemic reform initiatives. So firstly, please do make sure you subscribe. And if you want to contribute more broadly to our efforts, we have launched the Elevate Network, which is a private community where we are tackling these issues and others, looking at how we can more broadly transform the world in the wake of COVID-19, recognizing some of the undercurrents, some of the trajectories that we've been on over the last 2 years, the centralization of power, the kind of rise of authoritarianism, the role of technocrats, the role of exponential technology. All of these things we're starting to look at the role of surveillance in more depth within the Elevate network. So if you'd like to be part of the conversation, please do join us over there at weareelevate.org. So there's a couple of ways for you to stay in touch, either via mailing list at danjgregory.com/pandemic or part of our community at weareelevate.org. Where you can join the conversation and find out more about the work that we're doing there. So thank you for participating and watching this important episode. I plan to go on for half an hour, but clearly this is an important subject, and I've gone through it with much more of a tooth comb than I originally intended. But it's such an important subject, and it's an important junction where we must get the result of ensuring the appropriate terms of reference in order that this inquiry follows the appropriate course. And then the next battle is making sure that the right bodies have the opportunity to present evidence. And that's another reason why the Pandemic Reform Committee, formalizing that entity, will hopefully give us a strong positioning and able to be considered as a body to support the evidence. Now, the last thing I'll say is if you're watching this and you're a medical professional, you're a scientist, you're a legal professional, or you've worked across any of the realms that we've touched upon today, from economics, human rights, law, healthcare, education, and you would like to support our public inquiry efforts, please do get in touch. We would very much welcome your contact. We are looking to assemble as much expertise as possible to support with this, so please do get in touch if you haven't done so already. And lastly, given the importance and scale of the work that we're trying to do here, we do need to ramp up our funding to ensure that we can do this professionally. And the reality is this is going to last for probably 3 to 5 years. So we do need to look at funding sources. So if you're connected to any organization or individuals, high net worth individuals, or those who wish to sponsor an effort of this nature, again, please do get in touch. We will also be opening up donations, etc., to enable everyone to help support the initiative, because it's a long road ahead, and we're going to need to make sure we've got enough fuel in the tank to do this properly. So watch this space, and lastly, please do share this episode to make sure more people are aware of the nature of this public inquiry. It's an important time in history, and we all have a role to play. So please hit the share button. And I wish you a good night. Have a wonderful weekend. Thank you so much for tuning in. And I appreciate you. I'll see you again on Monday for our latest episode of the Pandemic Podcast. Good evening for now. Thanks again. I'm Astin-Gregory.